physical activities plus techniques in positive psychology and mindfulness. She's also recently written a book, A Brain to Life, which is for the layperson to help guide them to reduce the symptoms or the development of dementia, and also the expression, the symptoms of dementia through the life cycle. I'm sure Nicola can explain all these things much better than I can, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation, Julie. Firstly, I'm not allowed to move, and I usually do pace a bit when I'm talking, so remind me that this is being going live or streaming or something, so hello, other people. I need to introduce myself a little bit. And then principally, I guess there's a lot of collective wisdom and experience in this room, and I certainly don't claim to know everything, and I certainly haven't experienced everything as a clinician. So because this is your forum as much as mine, please, if you've got a question, put your hand up. If you've got an observation or a contribution that is compatible with the things that are being presented, please share, because we can all benefit from that collective brain power. So I am a neuropsychologist. I started working in a traumatic brain injury and moved off more generally into acquired brain injury. And then I started thinking that my role in that position was very much like the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And then I thought, well, how do I get myself to be the ambulance at the top of the cliff? And that's kind of where I moved into neuropsychiatry and did my PhD in the prevention of dementia. And I'm sure, as you know, if you do a PhD, you just find a whole pile of magical doors to go through and explore new ideas, and your learning never really stops. So that's kind of where I've got up to with my career. So I'm continuing with the UNSW School of Medicine or Neuropsychiatry. I'm currently involved in a research project at Oxford, Cochrane Reviews, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So I'm doing 3 Cochrane Reviews at the present moment. And I have a small private practice in the city. So today's talk is called Changing the Mind and Building the Brain, and I guess there's a lot of things that can fall into that. And I want to put my interest into a broader context again. So in my family, my mother did sociology, and so she was a big proponent of the nurture argument. My dad is an evolutionary ecologist, in particular studying the genetic component to altruistic behaviour. So I grew up in a house where the nature-nurture argument was rampant. And I could never get to a consensus, and either could they. So I started actually in clinical psychology, not in Australia, and then I thought, you know what, I want to understand more about the lump of grey between our ears. And you know, Freud did say this a very long time. As you all know, he was actually a neurologist. That was his first lot of training. He was a neurologist. And then he went into psychology or psychodynamic. And he said one day everything we'll know will be based on an organic substrate, something tangible. Yet despite that, Hill said this in 2007, that interesting as psychologists, we're not required to have knowledge about the organ that we treat. And so we've lived in psychology, and as I said, I've done clinical psychology, I've done neuropsychology, and I've ended up doing a PhD in neuropsychiatry. So I'm very clearly confused about what's going on in terms of all these different forces. But for what we're talking about today is about changing the mind and changing the brain, and that is born about this. So currently, under Medicare and workers' comp and all those things, the biggest burden is mental illness. That includes cognitive illnesses. So it used to be that cardiovascular disease was the biggest killer of Australians. It is about to swap over and become cognitive disease, or specifically dementia. And that is about to become the tipping point also in the things like workers' comp, mental health and cognitive and so forth. So we're talking about how do we look after our brain, so we have the beautiful one there on your right rather than the walnut looking one on your left. Because the statistics are that over the age of 85, almost one every second person will have dementia. So 1 in 2 over the age of 85. But, you know, with numbers, it depends which study you look at. But that's certainly what the Americans have just estimated, that it's 1 in 2. And as I said, in Australia, we're getting to this tipping point where it's going to be the #1 killer. And what does that mean for us? You know, I do a lot of talks, and I get a lot of people over the age of about 80 coming to my talks, and that's fine, because they want to look after their brain. But the reality is we actually need to start looking way beyond that. So the International Alzheimer's Research Group actually look at prenatal factors as risks for dementia. Early development in 3 years. And I'll explain that later. If you understand about attachment and secure attachment, we now understand that if you are an anxiously attached baby, your brain will develop differently and you'll be more vulnerable later on in life because you'll have less cognitive reserve. So my book has a big yellow sticker on it. That's purely marketing, not my intention. But it says reduce your risk of dementia. Well, the reality is what we're talking about is making sure that our brain span lasts our lifespan. And we're understanding more and more about lifestyle and mental health contribute to that risk. So any neuropsychs in the audience? Are we all everyone's psychs? Okay. Interrupt if I say something that you find too provocative or anything like that, but let's talk about how we can look after our brains. So my book and a lot of the research now understands 4 particular things. So we need to improve brain health, and if we improve brain health, we inherently improve psychological health. Okay? We cannot take out psychology from the health of the brain. The second thing we need to do is reduce brain burdens. So those are things that compromise brain health and brain function. So we're talking about an organic, tangible organ, and we're talking about dynamic processes. The third thing we need to do is build brain reserve. I'll explain all these concepts. And the fourth thing, for want of a better term, is cultivate a wise mind. So if we start off with boosting brain health, the first thing we have to look at is the body. And I'm sure you all know this, or maybe you do, but the person next to you doesn't. The brain shares most of what goes on in the body. So there is the blood-brain barrier that protects the brain from a lot of things, obviously not substances, because we take them because they cross the brain-blood barrier. But a whole lot of other things that happen in our body fundamentally impact the health of our brain. And as you'll see, some of them compromise mental health as well. So again, the World Alzheimer's Research Group identifies everything on that screen. So I'm not sloppy when it comes to evidence. I am involved with Cochrane Review, so I would hope that would indicate that I follow systematic reviews, meta-analyses and gold standard kind of research. So Barnes and Yafe and Barnes in particular, were involved in a large study. They pooled various studies from around the world, and they number crunched them, and they worked out the relative risk of lifestyle factors to dementia. Now the article Barnes and Yafe came out first, and what they found is that 2 in 3 cases of dementia were going to be predicted by lifestyle factors. Then they were challenged and they went fair call, because someone said some people have more than one risk, and we absolutely know that. There's a group of the population that will have no lifestyle risks, there's a small group that will have 1, and then there's another group will have 3 or 4. I do work for Transport New South Wales, and the average person working in Sydney Trains and Sydney Rail has 4 lifestyle risk factors. So when they re-crunched them, obviously the risk factors changed somewhat, but you can still be assured that it's still very high. So smoking, for example, and I'm not going to talk really any more about smoking other than this, contributes 16% of the risk for dementia. Just smoking. And as you will appreciate as clinicians, that things like alcohol, smoking, illicit drugs, poor sleep, stress, outcome, lack of exercise and obesity and so forth have often got psychological illness or mental health illness issues associated with them as well. So we've got to start looking at a much broader picture when people present to us. I saw a woman and she was referred by a friend, and she sat down in my office on Thursday and she said, I've been feeling really depressed, and she talked to me about what was going on. And I looked at her and, yep, she's a similar age to me, and I said to her, I hope you don't mind me asking, but where are you in menopause? And she said, I thought that had something to do with it. What she described to me was three months of hot flushes, followed by nothing, but 3 months of depression. Now the reality is she'd gone to her doctor, and her doctor had told her that there was nothing with mood and menopause. So it's not just psychologists, it's medical profession. We need to have a much bigger view of what's going on. And attached to that is one of my little bugbears, and we're going to talk about food. Who woke up this morning and chose a breakfast that was going to boost their brain? Who consciously thought, I need to feed my brain? Now, I won't ask who didn't have breakfast, because you wouldn't want to admit to that, because you've set your day up under physiological stress. Your brain needs energy. So the adult brain takes 25% of the energy that you eat. 25%, that's a quarter of all your food. So the brain is a very expensive organ to run. And if we're not feeding our body appropriately, then we've set up already a system of physiological stress. So it doesn't take long if you're already revving too high. You won't be aware of it necessarily. If you're already revving high physiologically, it's not going to take much to tip you over to have psychological stress versus physiological stress of hunger. And your brain doesn't tell you it's hungry. It gets indecisive, trouble making decisions, and forgetful. So there are a lot of studies that have looked at what children eat in the morning and their school performance. A colleague of mine, Dr Heather Francis, she has done some amazing research on diet and receptiveness to chemotherapy, by the way, for oncology. But she's also been looking at diet and neuropsychological function. And as you appreciate, when you do research, you're not allowed to cause harm. So she got ethics approval to get a whole bunch of university students to have breakfast and do cognitive testing before and after. That sounds pretty simple. So she found out what the average university student in Sydney was eating, and she gave them the healthy alternatives. So one group had things like a Tim Tam milkshake, followed by a fast food egg and bacon roll. The other group had a fruit smoothie and a wholemeal ham and cheese sandwich. So pretty good approximations, but one of them was much nutritionally rich and the other one was highly processed. They had to stop the experiment within 2 weeks because you are not allowed to do harm. So within 2 weeks, they found that the students having the nutritionally poor diet were starting to present with, relative to them, memory and concentration problems. So fundamentally, what we eat will either set us up to perform well during the day or not. But the research also shows that what we eat over our lifespan, starting in our 30s, impacts risk in the later half of your life. So we need to start thinking about what are we eating. Who has a pet? According to South Australia, Flinders University, 40% of Australians have pets. So hands up if you've got a pet. I'd just like to know whether the Flinders study is still valid. Okay. If you have a sick pet and you go to the vet, what does the vet ask you? What are you feeding it? What's the dog eating? How many times have people here gone to the doctors and said they're unwell, or had clients who've gone to the doctor and said, I'm depressed? Has the doctor said, what are you eating? And you know what? That's a very important question, because a large study in the UK of over 1,000 individuals found that a highly processed diet increased your risk for mental illness by 25%. This was replicated, I don't know if anyone picked this up in the news, a couple of months ago, again out of South Australia. They looked at diet and rates of depression, and they got a whole lot of people to have a healthy diet as treatment for depression, and within a couple of weeks their symptoms were ameliorating. And there's a reason for that. It's basic, it's chemistry. What is serotonin made of? I mean, SSRIs, serotonin, and antidepressants still primarily focus on serotonin, although there is increasing use of melatonin, because melatonin kicks back and increases serotonin and vice versa. There's a bidirectional relationship between those two, and the Brain and Mind Research Institute in Sydney is now looking at melatonin exclusively for the treatment of depression. But what do we make melatonin and serotonin out of? I mean, how many people have actually thought about this? It's what we eat. It's what we eat. And if we're eating a poor diet, our brain cannot make the essential neurotransmitters and hormones required for normal, healthy mental health and physiological health and brain health. So we need to think about what people are eating in terms of looking after their well-being. Who, when they have clients, regularly actually asks, "What are you eating?" Okay, well that's great to see, because no one, basically everyone who comes to my office is already prepped that they're not going to leave the first session without me already finding out what, I get bloods done and so forth before people come and see me, but I go through what are you eating, about your sleep, and so forth and so forth. Because it's very, antidepressants take a couple of weeks to start being effective, but a good diet will make a difference overnight. Now, because of risk of harm, it's very difficult to do studies where you give people a healthy versus unhealthy diet. And it's been known from population studies for a long time that people living in the Mediterranean diet, are healthier, have longevity, there's a whole lot of health benefits to that diet. And it has recently been put to the test in a randomised control trial, which was kind of interesting to randomise it, but they did. Because obviously randomised control trials are the best type of research, and it was proven. So not only has it been shown from population studies, cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, it's actually now been demonstrated by randomised control trial. And as I say to clients, the Mediterranean diet doesn't require imported, out-of-season, expensive food that you don't know how to pronounce the names of. Okay, I got to this age with only starting to eat quinoa a couple of years ago. It is possible. Okay, so what you want to think about is things in fruit in season. Basically, Australia is an amazing food basket. So again, we can replicate naturally within Australia the essential components of the Mediterranean diet. And in particular, I guess, for serotonin, you want tryptophan. Now, I don't have any shares in any food product, but the best way to get tryptophan directly into the system is chicken and turkey. Okay, so you have other amino acids, they've got to be converted by enzymes into tryptophan, so those contain tryptophan straight away. The second basic thing which you're all familiar with that we need to address, not only for mental health but also for brain health, is sleep. And sleep, as you're well aware of, is one of those areas of life where people think they can scrimp and scrape and get by with a little. Now, we understand how essential sleep is for well-being because there was that fantastic Fatigue Kills campaign, and 1/3 of motor vehicle accidents are caused by fatigue. But the other problem with fatigue is it increases insulin. So it's a risk for metabolic syndrome. And that has a cascade effect for dementia risk. Also, weight gain, obesity, and diabetes. The other thing about fatigue is we know poor work performances, problem solving, difficulties, decision making, impulsive risk taking behaviour. So someone might be setting themselves up here if you've got a mental health problem for risks and accidents. We also know that fatigue is associated with mood swings and behavioural difficulties. The other thing about sleep that you'll appreciate, the brain as the master clock allocates time to all our other organs to rest, restore and repair. And if we're fatigued, our brain doesn't do that very well. So the consequences are that our heart doesn't get enough rest, our immune system doesn't get a boost, and so forth. Okay, so we know that fatigue or chronic disordered sleep and so forth, you increase your risk for morbidity, so being sick, and you also increase your mortality, you shorten your lifespan. And we know that from shift workers principally, but just there's a low wear and tear. The other thing we've learned about sleep relevant to brain health is that when we're sleeping, memory is consolidated. So our brain goes through a process of perhaps augmenting and embedding some memories and potentially rewriting over others. And this is the risk of impaired sleep or disturbed sleep is now being investigated at the Brain and Mind Sydney University under Ian Hickey. He's looking at sleep as a risk for mild cognitive impairment because of its impact on memory spindles, memory formation, memory consolidation, hippocampal atrophy and risk for dementia. So we've started off, basics of fatigue to mental health. Again, if you're tired and you're not having breakfast, you're already setting yourself up at risk for the day. And you know this, and it's freely available, sleep hygiene, plenty of things you can do. And again, in terms of how do I go from what I learned to practice, I get clients to fill out a week in the life of, so starting at what time they wake up, and I literally want to know what time they wake up, what they drink, what they eat, hours of sleeping, whether they lie in bed awake or picking up all that disturbed sleep, and how they're spending their time. Because it's really tough, as you all know, being agents of change, how difficult it is to get people to make changes. And the research suggests that it's actually often easier to subtract a bad behaviour, not good term, unhelpful behaviour, maladaptive behaviour, than it is to push in another one. And that's kind of what we do in our job, be it changing a thought, swapping over a thought, be it changing a lifestyle. That's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to find the balance, keep the motivation, and help with the transfer to make the new one stick. But it's the same with all of these things. So the second thing I want to cover is reducing brain burden. And I could talk a lot here. We could cover alcohol in particular, since it's Dry July. It's funny, I'm helping Dry July, and I made the comment, and that people like being intoxicated, but there's a really important 5-letter word in there, and it's called toxic. So whilst I drink wine and champagne, and occasionally a spirit, I have no illusions that alcohol is not toxic. Okay, and we know it is a burden, and it's a risk, as you know, substance abuse, misuse is a risk for mental illness. But what I do want to talk about is stress, and in particular, and as you appreciate, the risk to mental illness. So the stress response is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And it's incredibly fast and incredibly powerful, as you appreciate. Bang, at the subarachnoid or the adrenal glands, bang, we're all on fight, flight or freeze. Okay? Now there's a cost of that whole system in society today, because as you know, it's meant to be short, sharp bursts and turn off. But the reality is a lot of people are walking around without turning it off. I had a woman come into my office, and she works for the state government, so this probably won't surprise you. But she sat down, and we were having a chat because she was referred to me. But she said, "I'm not stressed. I don't know why my doctor sent to you. I'm not stressed." And after half an hour, I asked her to count every breath inhalation she was taking. So she's been sitting in my room for half an hour, and she was still breathing 25 times a minute. Now the average is 10 to 14. And I said to her, "And you're not feeling stressed?" And she goes, "No, I'm not stressed." Okay, that was so her new normal. But when I reflected to her that she was breathing like she was running from a tiger, She realised, okay, maybe my GP hasn't got it wrong after all. The thing is, we become acclimatised to what's going on. And counting breaths is a really quick way, of assuming you've got a client who hasn't got asthma or something like that, is a really good indication of finding out how if they're on or not in terms of the sympathetic system responding. The problem with chronic stress is it becomes a burden, allostatic load, and we know it kills brain cells. Is anyone involved with, for example, Vietnam vets? Anyone doing chronic PTSD work or anything like that? Okay. So you'll be aware of the literature, but for other people in the room, chronic PTSD is a huge risk for dementia, because what happens is the cortisol in particular is quite corrosive to the brain, and the structures that suffer are memory. Okay, so it shrinks the hippocampus. The other thing that happens when they look at the brains of people who have chronic, and that is chronic highlighted, okay, we are talking about chronic mental illness, is the amygdala gets larger. Okay, so the emotional responding part of the brain gets larger. And I'm sure everyone's heard about the brain that changes itself and, neuroplasticity and so forth. Okay, there is a cost to neuroplasticity. And one of the costs is, if you've got a chronic PTSD, anxiety or depression, the amygdala gets bigger because it's being worked more. And what that means for the HPA is that the amygdala starts to create too much influence forwards on the prefrontal cortex. It's punching above its weight. It's got too large, it's creating too much noise forwards, which is inhibiting the prefrontal cortex. So there's two things going on. One is the hippocampus shrinks, okay, atrophies, and the amygdala gets bigger in volume because it's being overworked. And then, of course, you've got the other cascade of things of immune system, metabolic disorder, etc., etc. And fundamentally, you reduce the capacity for neurogenesis as well. Okay, not neuroplasticity, but neurogenesis, because apart from the brain areas focusing on smell, where you do get new brain cells, the only other point in the brain is for memory system, is where you get new brain cells for neurogenesis. So what we need to do with stress is try and get people to engage in their prefrontal cortex. Okay, and if you do CBT or anything like that, any therapy, what you're wanting to do is get people to shift from, you want to quieten down the emotional responding, the HPA, and you want to engage in goal-focused or strategic behaviour. Because let's face it, that's what the system was designed to do, meant to give you the kick to survive, and also, because a little bit of stress is positive, it enhances learning and so forth. It's the too much that's the problem. And it has been suggested that 99% of our activity is actually automatic. Okay, so it's pretty habitual. Now, because the brain is a very expensive organ to run, that makes sense. Okay, it takes less brain energy for your brain to be on automatic pilot. But what happens is people respond automatically to things when ideally being strategic is more advantageous for them. So much of that automatic responding is not advantageous. That's when people need to start engaging, and that's one of the what you do for your living in terms of clinical psychologists. So William James said that what we do is automatic, and it hasn't been disproven. So the burden of disease is largely now, because we haven't got contagious, most diseases now aren't contagious, they're lifestyle diseases. And what we found, not only is it important to engage the prefrontal cortex, they've now understood that there's asymmetrical motivation of behaviour in the cortex. Whereas if you lean to the left is considered an approach, like we talk about approach behaviour, but we actually know that that's the left, and there's much more, and she's standing back to describe it, the right is an avoid pain and disgust. And what they've done is they've tested this not just on humans, but they've also looked at a whole lot of different animal species, and they video them from above, and you see the same thing. There's this lean to the right, right, or the lean to the left. And what we want people to do is lean to the left, because that's an approach positive behaviour. And if you want to motivate change, it needs to be an approach thing. So that's what we're appealing to. And it's the left. For most people, it's going to be language. So it's really important to use language and an explanation and get that sort of deep comprehension and understanding. So we want to cajole the brain. Cajole the brain to the left. So Daniel Goldman has done a lot of work in this, and that's what we want to do. We're playing into the left prefrontal lobe in therapy and so forth. And there are obviously different therapeutic techniques, but that's where you kind of want to get to. I'll swing back on some of this stuff later. So we need to build cognitive reserve and brain reserve. So brain is the organic substrate, and cognitive reserve is brain processes. And you know, if you're a CBT person, that's what you're doing, isn't it? You're building cognitive reserve. You're changing the way people think. You're hoping that becomes, to shift from automatic processing to strategic, cognitive, intentional, all those sorts of words, but they're all about a person having autonomy and conscious effort. But in order to look after the brain, particularly across the lifespan and through mental illness and so forth, we need to build reserve. And Yaakov Stern in the States in particular is the person who's driven a lot of our understanding of this. And he's been supported by a lot of different studies, including an international effort that decided that, it's very easy to prove the hypotheses that you have neuropathology leads to dementia, because you just look at all the brains of people with dementia and you see neuropathology. Okay? So some clever person said, well, why don't we look at the brains of people without dementia? Okay, and this is where the terms, people differentiate between clinical dementia and dementia or dementia pathology came in. Because what happened is they looked at the brains of people without clinical dementia, so these are people who died of maybe other causes, cardiovascular disease, who are presenting to the world like there was nothing wrong with them cognitively, and over half of them had neuropathology in their brains. So the evidence suggests that we actually start getting plaques and tangles, which are the hallmark neuropathological markers of Alzheimer's, in our 30s. That's quite confronting, isn't it? It means I've had 20 years of it already. Excuse me. So this led to the understanding that there's obviously got to be a load. Resilience is such a lovely term and it's being used all the time, but now we're talking about brain resilience. Okay, there seems to be that people can tolerate a certain load, and people who have a lot of brain reserve and cognitive reserve are able to tolerate more pathology for longer. What they found is that group of people who've got a huge brain reserve won't be symptomatic for a long time, and then they'll become symptomatic, and then they will die within about 3 years rather than the 16 years. I've got 3 grandparents with dementia. 2 of them have already passed away. But my maternal grandmother, I picked up that she had cognitive changes when she was in her 80, and she's now 96. Now, I thought her cognitive reserve would have been reasonable. She spoke a couple of languages, played sport till her 60s, played bridge, and she's still going. She's got a strong heart. But so the understanding is with brain reserve, you'll last late, and 81 for her generation is actually a late, and you'll die short, but that hasn't happened in her case. So what do we need to do to build brain reserve? It's based on this idea that the more we've used our brain in life, the more resilient it is. And the more you've used your brain, the more cognitive reserve you have as well. So cognitive, think of it as being a functional change, and brain as being structural. And this is all because of neuroplasticity. And there are a lot of different changes in neuroplasticity. So one I've already mentioned, which is the neurogenesis, the new brain cells. But the important thing is you also get arborealization, so that's the dendrites of brain cells get more branches. If you're going to have more branches, you want more synapses, so more cells can talk to each other. Then you get some functional changes. There's more connectivity going on. You also get this thing called synchronization, which means circuits start firing together. You also have changes in metabolism. Okay, so neuroplasticity isn't just about neurons, and in fact it's about a number of quite profound changes that go on in the brain. Now if you're going to have new brain cells, for example, what are you going to need? You're going to need a blood supply. So, you know, you can't, so that's another change. You have angiogenesis or vasculogenesis. So in one, you create new blood vessels, the others you reroute blood vessels. Okay, so there's a profound raft of changes supporting neuroplasticity, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that's really important. And people think of neuroplasticity, I've already alluded to this, as being a positive process. Neuroplasticity can be a negative process. So neuroplasticity, if it's positive, it's the brain expanding and growing. Studies have shown that if your world contracts and you're doing less and having less experience, the opposite occurs, which is the cliche, if you don't use it, you lose it. And Otago University did a lovely study, and they showed that by tracking people's geographical distance from their home and the level of engagement they had with the community. So they proved the reverse of what was already known in terms of an expansion as neuroplasticity, great positive change. They proved the opposite is also the case. Now, I have to thank Michael Valenzuela for this slide. What's important, the reason I have this slide, is to draw your attention to the scale, the temporal scale. Now, according to Medicare, we can fix people in 6 to 10 weeks. But if you look at the scale, if you're doing CBT or behaviour change, it's going to take a lot longer than that. So that's, you know, this idea that you can make changes very quickly, it doesn't happen that way. You can have small changes in terms of micro changes, just getting things moving, but if you want to make long-term changes to the way people think, compensatory network change or anything like that, you're looking at a prolonged period of time. That's if you're wanting to change the mind, change the brain. It takes time. And people need to have a realistic understanding of that. Now, Michael and a friend of mine, Chow, they, again, were thinking if this idea of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity is true, the more you use your brain, the more reserve you have, then if you've had LEQ, if you've had a lifetime of engagement, so they developed a lifetime engagement questionnaire, that's LEQ, if you've had a huge lifetime of using your brain, be it languages and sports and theatre and music and world travel and education and a demanding occupation, for example, you will have greater reserve than someone who hasn't used their brain over on, you know, if your brain's got an odometer, someone with less mileage. And they found that to be absolutely the case, and it's been validated again and replicated elsewhere. And as...
Excuse me, can I ask you something? Could you expand on negative neuroplasticity, please? I'm not certain that I understand what is the negative neuroplasticity. If you're,
okay, the brain grows with stimulation and change. So this guy Park in particular has been saying that the brain will not develop and have neuroplastic change if it's not given something novel and exciting. So what happens if we're not given novelty and stimulation, then things stop working. So you don't have neuroplastic change. So you don't, so when they look at rats, rodent studies, for example, if you're not using your brain, because your brain it's constantly got the capacity for neuroplasticity, but if you're not challenging your brain, the new neurons that get triggered just die off. Does that make sense? So rather than this constant process of change and regeneration and so forth, if you're not using your brain, it doesn't happen.
And I would say neuroplasticity exists or neuroplasticity doesn't exist. No negative or positive.
Oh, it exists. I'm not saying neuroplasticity exists, but what I'm saying is you can have a neuroplasticity.
In one case exists, in another case doesn't exist. negative, I wouldn't use terms negative and positive. Just yes or no?
Neuroplasticity exists, yes.
I can give
And
an
you can
example.
kill off brain cells, which will be negative brain change.
I think I can give an example, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard this at a neuropsych lecture ages ago, Elcon and Goldberg, who's in Australia. If, for instance, and Candler and Schwartz, I'm sure it's in their book, if, for instance, you bind two fingers together for long enough, you'll get the representation in the brain of only 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers. Okay? So that's a change which is, you could say it was a positive change, but it's just a change. The brain changes the way it represents things. Deaf people have different representation, or people who are going deaf, their brain will change.
That's right, and it's an adaptation. That's right. Yes, I'll just leave it at that. But
Neuroplasticity in action.
that's right. So if you get rodents and they're running around in their house, because most of we can't sacrifice humans to look in their brains. In enriched environments, what they do is they get them to run around and have fun, and you can see neurogenesis. So you can see new brain cells and so forth. And then what they do, and then they compare them to others who aren't doing anything. And what happens is that, counting new brain cells is a very easy way to illustrate this, because they actually do this and they're still alive. So what they find is that the brains of both groups may generate 15 new brain cells. The ones who are using their brain, those brain cells survive and live. Those who aren't using their brains, the brain cells die.
Apoptosis.
Well, no, apoptosis is scheduled. That's got to do with critical periods and brain development, cell death. This is purely, and I've got a picture, this is pure, see that red dot? That's purely new brain cells coming off that need to go into the memory system or not. And if there's nothing going on in the brain, they will die. If the brain is active and got challenge and stimulation, they will live.
My understanding before coming to this presentation is that neuroplasticity is a positive process, and what you call negative neuroplasticity is in fact deterioration of the brain.
Well, maybe it's just a semantic debate, use of terms. Yeah, yep, just a different use of terms.
Can I just clarify, because I've thought of negative neuroplasticity as, for example, when you were speaking earlier about the effect of stress, shrinking the hippocampus, and that to me, it's a subjective value, but I see that as negative neuroplasticity.
Certainly not adaptive.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the term I should be using. It's not adaptive to have a amygdala that's getting too large, and it's not adaptive to have a hippocampus that's shrinking. Now, I said neuroplasticity does not happen in a vacuum. So you need brain-derived neurotrophic growth factors in order to have that. And in fact, there are multiple neurotrophic growth factors, but BDNF is the one that people talk about a lot, particularly because it's reduced in Alzheimer's disease, excessive fatigue, stress, okay, and so forth. But there are multiple others. There's VEGF, there's IGF, and so forth. And the important thing is we probably haven't recognised all of them, but you need growth factors to have any neuroplastic change in the brain. So if this is a schemata of what BDNF can do, crosses over, it's brain derived, it can stimulate the growth of a neuron, it can do an endothelial cell, or so forth. Angiogenesis will be a vascular supply to the new neuron. So neurogenesis and neuroplastic change will not happen in a vacuum. And again, if you saw in that previous slide, BDNF is reduced in fatigue and stress diet. All those things will reduce your possibility of that. I'm just going to bump through because I've looked at the clock. So one of the important things for stimulating neurotrophic growth factors is physical exercise. And we all know physical exercise is good for us because we've been hearing this for decades. in terms of our metabolic system, our weight bearing, mental health, stress reduction, bone health and so forth. But one of the exciting things is that we know that it fundamentally impacts dementia risk. So Barnes has done a lot of research in this. My PhD is also in this, but I tend to cite other people's research. Anyway, Barnes did this interesting study, and it is estimated that if you've got people who don't exercise to exercise, you could reduce the risk of dementia by 25%. And that's because it stimulates brain-derived neurotrophic growth factors, as well as decreasing stress, which is an inflammation burden, and health risks inflammation burden, and we understand that you have to reduce inflammation as much as possible. So there are different mechanisms why exercise is important. In my PhD, we actually did resistance training, because a lot of the research in this area is in aerobic exercise. I said I was involved in Cochrane. The reviews are exercise, brain training, nutrition and nutritional supplements. Those are the suite of reviews I'm involved in. So most of the studies have done aerobic exercise, which improves cognitive function and seems to stimulate brain-derived growth factors in particular. Whereas resistance training, like my PhD, we know improves different cognitive functions, but seems to be involved in stimulating insulin-like growth factors, IGF. So we're not entirely sure quite what's going on, but there does seem to be a differential benefit. And so the pathways, we're not entirely sure, because obviously you've got a muscle contraction and it goes over to crosses the blood-brain barrier. With aerobic function, obviously improving cardiovascular health is good for the brain, but there's a direct trigger as well of brain-derived growth factors. So that's still being unpackaged, but it's randomised control and population studies are all supporting the notion that exercise to look after your brain, and then you can look at the other benefits, in terms of mental health, stress, inflammation and so forth.
Excuse me. Do you know if the research that you're looking at with the Cochrane Review is also including studies that have looked at whether these effects have been shown in people with cognitive decline as well?
Yeah, that's covering 3 population groups: young adults, old adults without, and adults with. The other thing we've got to do, which I came up with the important question and comments before about neuroplasticity, is that if your brain is not being challenged, the capacity for neuroplasticity is exceedingly limited. So the idea is to use your brain and stimulate your brain. So again, those rodent studies, they clearly showed you do exercise, you get these changes, and then if you are mentally stimulated, then you increase survival. And that's pretty much what we need to do with people. As an aside, we found out exercising before mental activity is the best way to go. So you do exercise first before mental activity, just because of the growth factors. So the exercise stimulates the growth factors, and then the mental activity increases survival rate. If that, okay?
Is there a dose-response relationship?
Mm-hmm. For physical exercise, absolutely.
And is there a critical?
Oh. Well, no, because there's some variability there, individual difference. I can't, but there is absolutely a dose-response relationship's been shown. Yep. Yep. Less so with mental activity. I mean, the LEQ does, but not in a nice way from a randomised control trial. That's longitudinal, things like that. But in my PhD, we got people to be mentally active, and we measured their brain before and after, and we had those who were more active had increased hippocampal volume, which is a clear cause and effect, dose effect, but in terms of how that translates to hours, really, given everything else, it'd be hard to do. I'm sure someone's now trying to calculate that out, but yeah. Another really important thing for brains and mental health is relationships. So my honours degree was looking at social support and cardiovascular health. And so health psychology for a long time understood the benefits of relationships. In terms of dementia prevention, the mechanisms aren't entirely understood, or rather perhaps it's multifactorial in terms of good health benefits and so forth, but there definitely seems to be an association of positive relationships and reduced risk. I like to understand all the causal factors first, but Alzheimer's Australia and other bodies are recommending the importance of relationships for brain health, and we know they work for mental health. Connections to other people, your colleagues, work colleagues, family are essential for psychological well-being, and psychological well-being is important for brain health, and vice versa. I had the opportunity of interviewing 1,000 old people for Seniors Week and asked them their number one tip for life, and they recommended positive relationships hands down. It's the best recommendation for a long and rewarding life, according to them. And as I mentioned, health psychology for a long time has known about boost to immune system, decrease inflammation, lower stress, mental health, etc., etc. So fourthly, a wise mind. What do I mean by that? Ancient philosophers said that there is a wisdom for well-being that had 3 pillars. And the first pillar was the understanding of where one is at any one particular moment in time. Where am I today? Who gets in touch with, don't have to put your hands up, but who gets in touch with themselves every day before they step out the door? Where am I today? The second step of wisdom is to know where your ideal is. When you're at your best, when are you flourishing, thriving? When are you at your best? And the third part is the knowledge about how to close the gap. And as clinical psychologists, that's what a lot of people look to you for, to help them close the gap from where they are when they arrive to where they would ideally like to be. But it's important that we do that for ourselves. Now, in the profession of psychology, one of the things we do is change how people think. And I think it's fantastic that they've now done studies that show that psychotherapy, we've known, in Medicare they talk about how CBT is evidence-based better treatment for depression than pharmacological treatment. What's really important is that they've looked at the serotonin, changes to serotonin following CBT, and I think this sort of stuff is really, really exciting.
But not just 10 sessions.
Maybe that's me being political. So what we're doing is we're changing the way people think, and if we're changing the way they think, then you are rewiring their brain. That's what Hebb said. Brain cells that fire together wire together, and that's exactly what neuroplasticity does. Okay, and that's what you do in therapy. Of one kind or another, the narrative, the psychodynamic, the solution-focused, whatever it is. But essentially you're asking someone to do things differently, think about things differently, and that change has major implications for what's going on. The other thing we're doing though is we're changing from automatic habits, so automatic processing, and trying to engage that prefrontal cortex so that people start being more conscious, reflective of what they're doing. Now, coming to the end, I just wanted to talk about meditation. So different forms of meditation are associated with different brainwave patterns, but importantly the different types of meditation that people do also impact different parts of the brain. And the Dalai Lama has been crucial to some of this research because he's offered his monks to go and pop themselves in a scanner when they're doing certain types of meditation. So for example, meditation on empathy is different to a meditation on something else. And what they found is there's increased cortical thickness, in particular grey matter, changes in gamma band activity, but I've seen subsequent studies, there's a lot that have found that visualization, for example, will change the brainwave patterns differently to other types of of meditation. But importantly, they're fundamental in emotional regulation, so the down regulation of the HPA. And, you know, for some of our clients, they've had turbulent lives, and at the beginning I said how the World Alzheimer's Research Group was talking about prenatal and postnatal time as being crucial. So what they've found is that prenatal events in the last trimester, so the mum's worry only in the last trimester, will change the sensitivity of the baby's HPA, stress response, so that it becomes more sensitive, so they are less resilient, they are more likely to be anxious. And similarly, when they look at young people, babies with poor attachment, they have less brain reserve, they have less grey matter and white matter in their brains with chronic attachment problems, and they tend to lean to the left in terms of dominant brain functioning. So there's a lot of different research that's reinforcing these ideas. And unfortunately, it's, as you can appreciate, it's very hard to do this kind of psychological research. But September 11 provided an incredible opportunity to look at these things, and that opportunity was taken up within about 24 hours of September 11. So research centre in psychiatry contacted every single pregnant woman who was at or in proximity to the towers and enrolled them into their research study. And they were able to track their emotional responding, and they've tracked their newborns, and they've tracked that newborn since then. And they've shown what animal studies have already shown in terms of down regulation and so forth, or increased sensitivity. The other interesting thing, is that it changes the genetics. Now, I haven't even talked about epigenetics, but because we're going to run out of time, clearly given my childhood background, the genetics component to all of this I find fascinating, but it is to suffice to say that our understanding of epigenetics is only just starting. So I'm sure you all know this, but when they set out to do the Human Genome Project, they expected there'll be something like 200,000 genes, and they didn't find that to explain the diversity, so they only found 70,000. So they knew something else had to be happening, and a paediatrician, neurologist, geneticist person in London, in the UK, was actually crucial in understanding epigenetic phenomena. And so they've realised that life experience turns on genes on and off in our lifetime. So we can have a genetic risk for something and we can turn it on by lifestyle, or we can turn it off by lifestyle. But what the September 11 study shows is that even the experiences in utero can change your genes, because when they've done that, those kids aren't obviously big enough to have children, but when they do those sorts of studies with animals, cause pregnant rats stress and trauma, and then follow the pups, they can see that they've started to rewire the brain. So there is this understanding of genetics. We're getting a much bigger idea of genetics and mental health problems and susceptibility and so forth, as well as obviously learning behaviour. So that's my little digression. Just to quickly wrap up, about wisdom, obviously there's a lot that could fall into here, and as clinical psychologists, this is what you help your clients to do. Other things to get them to perhaps think about themselves is getting a calm mind, because we know a calm mind means a healthier brain. So pausing, emotional regulation, de-stressing, all those things are crucial to brain health and longevity. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the idea of meaning and purpose. There's a lot of research that's come around from around the world looking at the importance of meaning and purpose. Is anyone here a big advocate of positive psychology? Okay, well, certainly having meaning and purpose is been found to be quite crucial. And there's this wonderful quote that, you know, clinical psychology helps a person in a leaky boat plug the boat. All right, clinical psychology plugs the boat that the person's in so they don't sink. Positive psychology is what puts the wind in the sails so they can go off to their goals. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor. And certainly I sort of cover both camps and can take people in that journey. But meaning and purpose has been shown in lots of research to be important to ageing, well-being, mental health, and so forth. So the future, what does this all mean? We can't separate the mind and the brain. And generally my little bugbear is that I believe that working with someone, how they think and feel is crucial to their well-being. We know from Medicare that what we do as a profession is important and valid, but I don't think we should ever assume and rest on our laurels. I think we need to constantly strive for evidence and to support what we do. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was.
And I was about to say questions and book sales. Yes.
Do you have any thoughts, even indirect ones, about the management of anorexia in context of what you present?
Only in the context of what I said. I don't work in that field, but my understanding is there's a huge cost to the brain, obviously, because they're nutritionally starved, and ultimately, as you know, they die of a heart failure because the heart muscle's been leached of all its vitamins and minerals. So they're not on the same spectrum as a child that's profoundly malnourished, like starving, but their cognitive function is absolutely impaired as a consequence. That's my understanding of reading the literature. Yep.
Sorry, Nicola, on a slide there before, the wisdom, you had age with attitude, which I kind of liked. But what were you actually meaning by that? I mean, is there some research around that says, is that the whole thing of don't see yourself as being non-involved or able to be involved because you're getting on a bit, just stay relevant?
Age with attitude, absolutely. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. I've got too much stuff to say. Age with attitude, yes, they did a study at Harvard. Her name's not coming to me. It's about 30 years old. Fantastic study. Got a group of men. Because did you know it was only legislated that you actually had to have females in medical research only in the last 20s? Did anyone know that? Did you know that it was only recently legislated that if you did animal studies, you had to include female animals? That's only in the last 10 years. Anyway, just a little bugbear. Sorry. So yes, it was all men. What they did is they got a group of men, split them into two groups. One group had to imagine they were going back to their 50s and act accordingly, and the other group to just carry on as usual. And within 10 weeks, on a number of health markers, blood pressure, cardiovascular fitness and so forth, the group who were acting younger were reporting better results because they started to do things like take stairs and so forth. But attached to that is absolutely self-attitude, because in so many things, if you anticipate pain, you'll feel more pain, and that's from having an immunisation. It's the same thing. So if you start feeling old, it's the contraction, less engagement, downhill.
Sorry, Nicola, is it possible just to put that slide back up? I've just a couple of points I wanted to get down.
Okay, how about we do that? I'll do that at the end.
I was going to ask, is there research, talking about preventing dementia, is there research on the effects of increased screen time? Like, we know it affects areas like relationships and disengagement from the community. Is there a relationship between exposure to lots of screen time, with kids or teenagers or that, and risk of things like dementia?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know anyone that's looking at that because this generation is still young. But did you see the statistics 2 weeks ago about Australia? The recommendation for children is 14 hours a week. Did you see that? And they're up to 40. You saw the study that was on the news? You're nodding your head. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. They haven't followed that up, but there is concern related to another phenomena of the next generation. So my children's generation is not going to live as long as us in the room. So the human lifespan's been extending and now it's contracting back. And there are a couple of reasons: that exercise, obesity, diabetes, lack of exercise. Okay, so their lifespan is contracting back. The other issue that some of the people I hang out with in the Department of Neuropsychiatry, a bunch of nerds, is the increased use of substances. So the recreational use of alcohol and drugs is so much more prevalent that that's going to be a cost. And interestingly, some of my colleagues were also on the news a couple of weeks ago, and their research is suggesting that alcohol, I mean, the legal age is 18, but something like 40% of Australians, and that's from the age 14 and up, drink alcohol every week. So we're not talking about 18-year-olds. Alcohol is interfering the brain development of young people, and so we're not yet sure how that's going to play out. And let's face it, I'll probably be gone by then. But yeah.
You were talking earlier about food generating serotonin. And I was wondering whether there's any research on comparing, like if somebody was to fundamentally change their diet and versus the effect of SSRIs in boosting serotonin levels. Has that been, can it be as effective?
I don't know that I can't remember the results from their study, but don't quote me. I know it was very effective. That's why it broke into all the media. The results were so standout of people's improved mood. But a little bit of trivia, because I have lots of trivia. They did a study in the UK because of neurofeedback in terms of our face and our body to our brain. They did a study and they Botoxed the face of women with depression, so they couldn't frown. Because we've understood for a while that smiling, seventh cranial nerve, sends message back to the brain and says, person happy, must be happy, let's pump out some lovely, serotonin and maybe a bit of dopamine, a bit of oxytocin, whatever, right? And so they did the reverse. They Botoxed the face as of people so they couldn't frown, and within 2 weeks they reported improved mood. So, I don't have any shares in Botox.
It's also the apparently the use of Botox can bring up autistic symptoms as well, because they all of a sudden they don't not that they can't frown, but they can't read the other either. So there's the research on that as well. So they're becoming mildly autistic, if you use them. So
you can't. Those reflective neurons aren't firing.
Just ask you about exercise. I'm rather confused about whether it's 5 days for 30 minutes every day of moderate exercise, or whether it's 2 sessions of 20 minutes a day with spurts of intensive 5 minutes, then relax, which they're doing in South Australia at the moment as well.
Yeah.
Where are we up
The amounts change constantly depending on where you go, but they all say one thing: exercise. And that's right. Absolutely. It depends on what you're doing. The reason that high intensity training works for some people is because they might not be able to do low and steady. So the Canadian Middleton, for example, has done a lot of research just on walking. Okay, it doesn't have to be fancy. You don't need a gym membership. You don't need a fancy wardrobe and all that sort of stuff. Walking will confer benefits. If you can walk and talk, probably not high enough aerobic load. Okay, so you should do it so you're huffing and puffing and can't talk or sing, right? But there's a whole lot of benefits. So walking your dog with an active Twitter account that you stop every 2 metres doesn't count. That is not exercise. Okay, so if you can sing... You are engaged. You are, well, that'll be a walking meditation, wouldn't it? My understanding is you should go for half an hour, 5 days a week as a minimum. But again, I haven't double-checked the latest reading. But I think that's the recommendation from the American Sports
They say
Medicine,
180 minutes per week. 180.
which is 3 hours, which is the same.
Sorry, the high intensity changing or producing mitochondria or growth of mitochondria. So, I mean, that's different to taking the 30-minute walk 5 days a week. So is there a benefit in?
Well, you know, there's always a gap between what can be done in a university study and what is realistic in real life. Like I was at the Happiness and its Causes conference. Anyone else go to that? What I'm saying is not in any way meant disrespectful. But it's one thing to have someone who gets all their meals provided to them and accommodation who has to do nothing but meditate to say we should all meditate for 8 hours a day. Like, I really don't think that's a helpful message, because most of us have mortgages and all sorts, and have to get groceries and cook the food. We don't walk around with bowls and get food. Like, it's one thing to say be and it's another thing to be realistic in the 21st century. So there's a gap between research and reality, and all the government recommendations are trying to make it compatible and helpful.
Could I say, I have done a fair bit of reading on the exercise and brain health, and the take-home message is that resistance training, high interval training, they're both really good. And at least in a study that I read said the combination between the high intensity interval training and weight training is a really good approach, because both are amazing and do slightly different things. But I think it's like if you're doing something and you're getting your heart rate up.
Was that my study? So absolutely. So the idea is, yeah.
Just do something.
Yeah, and ideally do both. Because they have different, that's what I was saying to you, resistance training, stimulated IGF and aerobic stimulated BDNF. And also they have, they have different, one works your heart, one's better for your bones and your muscles. So the idea is to do different exercise, and balance and so forth is also a good thing to do. Vestibular control.
I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. It was very comprehensive and accessible. And also the mention about epigenetics, and just mentioning that attachment is being regarded as one of the biggest epigenetic factors, very important for us as psychologists. I wanted to ask you on another aspect about attachment with the relationships. Is there any research showing the effects of oxytocin and vasopressin on neuroplasticity?
That's an interesting question. They are doing that for autism at the moment, and I don't know if they've taken it the next step to see whether that's translated in brain change on emotional recognition, but they're certainly doing that. I know it's been a study going at UNSW, nasal spray, oxytocin. But I don't know if they've done the next part of which is the next causal question, isn't it? Is that a transient thing, or is it actually starting to change that part of the brain? Good question. Is caffeine good for the brain?
Yes.
Oh. Well, it's a stimulant, isn't it? And so I guess it's like all things, because we know that caffeine, if you've got an anxiety problem or anything like that, it's the worst thing you could possibly do. If you're all idling high because you've got stress, be it psychological or physiological, it's not the best thing to do, because it's just going to exacerbate that whole stress response. I know, thank you, the Alzheimer's Australia have it on their site, on their website of things to do. It certainly hasn't shown up in the Alzheimer's World group yet. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions from those two statements.
Nicola, I just want to make one other comment, sorry, and obviously it's coming from a brain injury background, just to make a comment that there are also limits to neuroplasticity as well.
Oh, absolutely, and brain injury is a huge burden on the brain and a huge risk factor for dementia. Yep, thank you for adding that.
Yeah, I think it's always an important message when people are thinking about neuroplasticity, and even with dementia and cognitive decline, there are people even who have been extremely
extremely high achieving engineers, and so on, and have looked after themselves very well, but still.
Absolutely, and I have those conversations with my clients. Expectation management. Yeah.
That they haven't tried hard enough.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Good contribution. Short and books.
Does that include concussion?
That's the last question, by the way.
Does that include concussions?
Brain injury in terms
Yeah.
Is there any, because there's a hell of a lot in sport now, isn't there, coming out?
Yeah, and I've seen a couple of footballers who are definitely on their way to having major cognitive problems, but I've also seen some that don't. So the reality is footballers in particular have a whole lot of other lifestyle factors going on for them that increase their risk quite often.
A lot decrease their risk as well, don't they? Because they're very fit, they eat well. So
Yeah. You think so? Alcohol, drugs. Anyway, so that's a problem in unpackaging that, but there is certainly it's a risk.
Yeah.
But there are lots of things going on, and I guess that's the complexity of the area. There's no hard and fast statements around that now, but it's recognised a risk, but not for everybody.
There's a lot of debate, isn't there?
There is a lot of debate. Yep, a lot of debate.
We might close it there. And if,
Anyone wants to buy a book? If anyone wants to buy a book.